So in this video, I want to talk a little bit about how to use custom written classes so that you can set up objects and use them inside of your Universal Windows applications. So in the last video, maybe you saw where I talked about making this app that just collects a little bit of information about a guest, first name, last name, dinner option, things like that, so that we could collect that information, demonstrate how to use it, and display it in a list box. Well, I have added a class, and I did this by right clicking on the project and going to add and then class. But here you can see my guest.cs inside of the project. And it contains our three public properties, first name, last name, and dinner option. And then I've set up the toString for this class to be basically what we were outputting earlier, which was last name, comma space, first name, and then a hyphen with the dinner option. So you can see referencing those properties here in the toString so that anytime someone outputs this guest object, it will use this toString information to do that. And so hopefully that's familiar if you've worked with class objects before. But how do we modify our submit button click to then implement this object instead, so that instead of putting this string into the list box, we could use an object? Well, once we've collected the three pieces of information that we have, notice I don't have a constructor. I could set up a constructor, certainly. Or we could just, set those properties directly. So I'm going to create an instance of an object. So guest, name it my guest equals a new guest, right? Empty constructor. So we just have the open and close parentheses. And IntelliSense immediately knows what I want to do. Take the first name property of my guest and set it to the first name property of first name variable, last name, and then my guest dot dinner option equals dinner. So we set the properties of the object, and now we don't want to concatenate this string because we want to use, again, the toString for our object. And here's the fun part. We should just be able to take my guest and put it directly into this list box as an object, and it will automatically come to the toString and use this information on how to format it for output. Now, some things to think about here. We don't call toString. If we call toString, then what's going to happen is it's going to put this into the list box as a string and not as a guest object. Because later, if you wanted to get the item out of the list box as a guest object, it would need to have been added to the list box as an object. The list box essentially, and maybe you get this from the syntax of how we add things, is really just a collection similar to a list. And so whatever object type we put in there, that's what we're going to get back out. And so our list box can hold items of different types, but when we go to take them back out, they're still the types that we put in there. So let's test this out and make sure it works as intended. So here's our application. I can put my first name and I can put my last name and I can choose my dinner option and I can submit. And then we get the format that we expected. But again, we're not doing it because we have formatted a string and put the string into the list box. We're doing it because we took all of those variables, put them into properties, and we're using the toString to get that information for us. So I had mentioned that sometimes you might want to actually get the information out of the list box as a certain object type. So let's go ahead and come over to our list box and set up a way to do that. So let's double click on our list box, and we should get the selection changed event. So selection changed occurs when the currently selected item changes. So let's actually reverse the process and say, well, I have a bunch of these guests in my list box. What if I click on them and I can make something else happen? So let's say if I click on an item in the list box, we actually populate these boxes instead. So how do we get the selected item out as a guest object. Again, you had to have put it in the list box as an object to begin with. And so here's our syntax. Our list box name, selected item as guest is basically a convert statement that says take this object out of the list box, and it has to be a guest because I want it as a guest, and put it into my guest. So now I can use it as an object. Now it is best practice to check and make sure that you didn't actually pull a null. Because if you did, then you've got to set up a try catch and make sure that you're catching this exception. But we'll just go ahead and check that it's not null before we proceed. Now we're going to kind of do the opposite of what we did up here, where we set the properties from what was in those boxes. So I'm going to say the first name box dot text needs to equal what's in my guest first name, and same thing with last name. And so the trickier part becomes setting the combo box. But if you've set this up right, we can just do dinner option, selected item, my guest dinner option, because the list box or the combo box is going to be able to determine that this selected item is the same as this item and that they actually match in the list. If you've done something funky with this information and it doesn't match, then it's not actually going to work. So let's take a look at what our application does now. So I can type in some test data here. Let's create ourselves a couple of guests. Okay. So if I click on one of these, everything should update to what it says in the list box. Because we are grabbing this. Let me put a breakpoint so you can see. So we're grabbing this selected item, which we can see these properties in here because it knows it's a guest, and we're putting it into this my guest instance here that we've created. So it populates those properties automatically because it knows it's an object and that those properties correspond to each other. We check for the null, and then all we're doing is saying the contents of the text box should equal whatever's in the property. And so easy way to transfer data back and forth in your application. So I hope this has helped you kind of wrap your mind around some of the concepts that maybe you're learning with classes, how to use objects, and then kind of enmeshing that with what you're learning about controls.